China Airlines Flight 642 is approaching Hong Kong International Airport facing the harsh conditions of tropical storm. Strong winds and heavy rain hit the plane as it continues to descend in the cabin. Passengers hold on to their armrests. As turbulence shakes the plane, the sound of rain hitting the fuselage and sudden drops in altitude keep everyone on edge. Outside, visibility is almost zero, and flashes of lightning only add to the tension. The pilots understand the risks, yet continue with the approach, but as they break through the clouds and see the runway, unexpected challenges emerge, pushing their skills and focus to the limit. Will their training and experience be enough to land safely? This is the story of China Airlines. Flight 642. It is August the 22nd, 1999, and China Airlines Flight 642 is being prepared for its journey from Bangkok to Taipei with a stopover in Hong Kong. The flight is operated by a McDonnell Douglas MD-11, a 7-year-old long-haul aircraft built in October 1992. Equipped with 3 powerful engines, it previously flew under Mandarin Airlines, still displaying its original livery. Despite its recent transfer to China Airlines, the aircraft had experienced 2 hard landings in the past. The first, in February 1995, caused damage to parts of the nose gear which were repaired and replaced after another hard landing. In August 1997, a thorough inspection found no further issues at the time of this flight. The MD-11 was functioning well with no outstanding technical problems. On board Flight 642 were 300 passengers and 15 crew members. This was the same crew who had flown the outbound trip from Taipei to Bangkok the previous day, stopping in Hong Kong where they had already encountered the early effects of Tropical Storm Sam. In mid-August, an area of circulation over the Philippine Sea developed into Tropical Storm Sam, which intensified into a typhoon. As it approached the Chinese coast on the day of the flight, the typhoon approached Hong Kong, bringing record rainfall and intense winds. Over 616 mm of rain had fallen, the highest recorded since 1884, with gusts reaching 35 knots near the international airport. During the pre-flight briefing, updated weather reports confirmed the storm's intensifying presence around Hong Kong, alerting the crew to expect high crosswinds, severe turbulence, and limited visibility in the hours leading up to departure. Air traffic control recorded nearly 10 go-arounds with multiple flights aborting their landings due to the hazardous conditions. Given the circumstances, the captain decided to load extra fuel, providing the flexibility to circle in a holding pattern attempt to go around or even divert directly to Taipei if necessary. With the added fuel, the flight was estimated to land just over 200 kg under the aircraft's maximum allowable landing weight. This near-limit weight provided additional stability but required a higher approach speed if the crew completed a successful landing on the first attempt. As departure time approached, the crew completed their final pre-flight checks while passengers settled into their seats with the checks finished and passengers secure the cabin crew closed and locked the doors as the pushback tug moved into position after clearance from ground control. The tug pushed the aircraft back from the gate once the engines were started and the pushback was complete. The captain and first officer performed final system checks. Confident that all was in order, they began taxiing toward the runway. In command was a 57-year-old captain, an Italian national who had previously flown for a major European airline before joining China Airlines in 1997. By this flight, he had accumulated almost 18,000 flight hours, including more than 3,000 hours on the MD-1. The first officer, aged 36 and born in Taiwan, had been with China Airlines since 1989. He had logged more than 4,600 flight hours with nearly 3,000 on the MD-11 after a few minutes of taxiing. The plane reached the runway, cleared by air traffic control. The captain pushed the 3 thrust levers forward to take off. Thrust. The engines roared as the aircraft accelerated down the runway, lifting off smoothly and beginning its climb toward cruising altitude. Once they leveled off, everything progressed as planned. The cabin crew completed their in-flight service, and passengers relaxed for the remainder of the trip. Hours passed, and as China Airlines Flight 642. Drew, closer to Hong Kong, conditions surrounding the airport had significantly worsened in the cockpit. The crew closely monitored these worsening conditions through the Automatic Terminal Information Service, or ATIS. This is a continuous broadcast providing up-to-date information on weather-active runways and approach conditions. This allows pilots to stay informed without contacting air traffic control directly. Each update is labeled using the NATO phonetic alphabet. Like Alpha or Bravo, the broadcast warned of severe weather, including significant wind shear, intense turbulence, and low-visibility surface winds were reported from 320 degrees at 30 knots, gusting to 45 knots and heavy rain, with the runway at 250 degrees. This angle resulted in a crosswind component of 26 knots, slightly above the airline's wet runway limit. However, the captain noted the wind direction was gradually shifting, hoping it would ease enough to permit a safe landing about half an hour later. At 6:14, radar control cleared the aircraft to begin its descent. In the meantime, conditions had changed slightly, and a new broadcast labeled X-ray provided updated information. It now reported surface winds from 3 degrees at 35 knots, result resting. In a crosswind component of approximately 25 knots, still just above the company's wet runway limit, Flight 642 began its descent. As the first signs of the tropical storm became evident, with worsening weather ahead, the crew requested a course adjustment. Air traffic control approved, assigning a new heading to help them steer around the storm cell as they navigated around the turbulent WW. The captain began briefing for an approach to runway 25 left, which the latest 8's update had confirmed as the active runway. Partway through, the first officer interrupted, insisting that they were actually cleared for runway 25. Right, trusting the first officer's input, the captain decided not to question it further, and they continued their preparations. As planned, despite the misunderstanding over the runway, Flight 642 cleared the worst of the turbulent weather, and air traffic control directed them toward the waypoint Mango. As they continued their descent at 6:25, the crew was handed over to approach control, which began radar vectoring them for what they still believed was an ILS approach to runway 25. Right as they descended further, the flight entered worsening weather around Hong Kong. Rain and wind intensified, prompting the crew to activate the aircraft's anti-ice system to prevent ice buildup on critical surfaces like the wings and engines. Passengers in the cabin could feel the storm. The plane shook in the wind. Rain poured against the windows and flashes of lightning lit up the surrounding clouds in the cockpit. The crew listened as Hong Kong approach broadcasted a warning to all nearby aircraft. A recent arrival had experienced a lightning strike around 400 ft during the approach. It was a clear reminder of the challenging conditions awaiting them. The crew acknowledged this and began configuring the aircraft. They extended the slats, and shortly after set the flaps to 15 in preparation for their final approach. As they neared the air report, Hong Kong approach directed the aircraft to a heading of 230 degrees and cleared them for an ILS approach to runway 25. Left only then did the pilots realize the runway mix-up, prompting an immediate rebrief on the correct procedures under heightened pressure. The captain quickly rebriefed the minimums and go-around procedure. Despite the added workload, they adjusted smoothly and refocused their ILS approach for runway 25. Left the ILS, or Instrument Landing System, is a precision radio navigation system that provides short-range guidance to aircraft during their approach to a runway. Although it can be used in any weather, it is especially valuable in poor weather or low visibility conditions, such as those caused by a tropical storm. The ILS works via two types of radio signals: the localizer and the glide slope. The localizer helps the pilots or the autopilot keep the aircraft aligned with the runway center line. It tells the pilots whether the plane is too far to the left or right, and helps guide it back to the correct path. The glide slope helps the pilots control the aircraft's descent angle, making sure it follows the correct slope down to the runway. It indicates whether the plane is too high or too low on the Approach about 14 nautical miles from touchdown, the aircraft was transferred to Hong Kong Tower and instructed to continue the approach the crew received, updated conditions visibility at 600 m and surface winds from 320 degree at 25 knots gusting to 33 knots. Noting this exceeded the crosswind limit, the captain proceeded, planning to recheck conditions below 1000 ft with the autopilot and autothrottle engaged the aircraft captured. The localizer and glide slope and the landing gear was lowered as they approached the runway. The crew carefully monitored airspeed and crosswind angles, aware that the challenging weather could test the plane's stability preparing for landing. The crew set the autobrake to medium, armed the spoilers, and extended the flaps to 35 dive-turin, configuring the MD-11 for a full landing setup. Up to this point, the landing had progressed smoothly. Even with the earlier runway confusion, the crew skillfully managed the descent, guiding the plane closer to the runway despite the worsening conditions outside at 1,000 ft above ground. Visibility remained limited by the driving rain with only occasional breaks in the storm clouds. The tension in the cockpit grew as they closed in on their final approach, knowing the most challenging moments were yet to come. At around 700 ft, the captain disengaged the autopilot, taking manual control of the descent, with the autothrottle still engaged to manage airspeed. As they drew closer, the runway lights became visible through the rain. The captain decided to continue. The approach, despite a final wind report of 32.20 degree at 28 knots, gusting to 36 knots, slightly above the crosswind limit in the cabin, passengers felt the full intensity of the storm. Flashes of lightning illuminated the distance, a grim reminder of the hazardous conditions surrounding the airport. The sound of rain hitting the fuselage and strong gusts shaking the plane added to the tension in the cabin. Everyone sat strapped in, waiting for a safe landing in the cockpit. The windshield wipers were set to high, battling against the heavy rain. The sheer volume of water hindered their effectiveness, occasionally obstructing the captain's view and adding to the demanding conditions, though the MD-11 was slightly low on the glide slope. It held its course along the runway center line. The captain employed a technique known as crabbing, angling the aircraft's nose into the crosswind to maintain alignment with the runway. So far, so good. But as they approached 300 ft, a sudden drop in indicated airspeed caught the crew's attention. The first officer called speed to alert the captain to the unexpected loss. The captain immediately advanced the throttles, pushing the airspeed up to 175 knots, about 15 knots faster than intended. Quickly correcting, he reduced the thrust to bring the speed back under control as the thrust decreased. The aircraft ascended through the 50T mark, prompting the auto-throttle system to bring the engines to idle in preparation for landing. At this critical stage, the airspeed dropped rapidly, likely due to a sudden loss of headwind combined with the early reduction in thrust. This caused a significant loss of lift accelerating the descent rate to a dangerous 18 ft per second. The captain attempted to flare the aircraft by pulling back on the control column to lift the nose, but although the nose lifted slightly, the descent rate remained too high. Moments later, the right main landing gear struck the runway, hard collapsing outward and triggering a series of structural failures. Almost immediately, the right engine cowling hit the runway, tearing open upon impact and further destabilizing the aircraft to the right wing. Detached, igniting spilt fuel and flipped the aircraft upside down, sliding across the runway in flames before coming to rest off to the side, engulfed in smoke and fire. The cockpit crew, disoriented by the upside-down position of the aircraft, struggled. To locate the engine controls, they faced difficulty in performing the shutdown procedures once they freed themselves. They moved through the cockpit door into the cabin. They exited the plane via the L1 door and began assisting passengers through. A hole in the fuselage, the emergency services response activated instantly upon the crash. With the alarm sounding throughout the airport, fire and rescue units mobilized within seconds, and within 1 minute emergency crews arrived at the crash site. The situation they faced was complex, as the MD-11 lay inverted with parts of the fuselage and wing on fire and passengers trapped inside. despite the heavy rain flames burned intensely due to the fuel leakage making containment challenging. The crash of China Airlines Flight 642 resulted in 3 fatalities and left 50 passengers and crew with serious injuries. The rapid response of the rescue teams minimized the potential for further casualties. The investigation concluded that the primary cause of the accident was the captain's inability to stop the rapid rate of descent at 50 hdm above the runway. Contributing factors included the captain's failure to notice and react to decreasing airspeed and the increasing rate of descent, along with the reduction of thrust to flight. Idle changes in wind direction and speed may have caused a brief loss of headwind, leading to a sharp drop in airspeed just before touchdown. Furthermore, limited side vision during the landing flare may have prevented the captain from noticing the quick descent rate in time. China Airlines responded by revising its standard operating procedures for landings in severe weather. The airline also enhanced crew training to better manage unstable approaches and high-press situations.